Welcome to the Being Known podcast with my friend, Dr. Curt Thompson.
And my friend, Pepper Sweeney.
We are here to discover what it means to be truly known. Hello, Curt.
Hey, Pep.
I am so happy to be with you here today.
Boy, right on.
I'm excited about today's episode. I really enjoyed this chapter. So for those of you who are just jumping into the podcast, this entire season is based on Curt Thompson's second book, The Soul of Shame. And we are going chapter by chapter for each episode. And I highly recommend that you pick up the book so that you can be fully prepared and really get the most out of the podcast and the book as you're going through it. I just am really enjoying this book and learning from it, and really feel like with the applications and everything else. And I think partly it's what you talk about just what you're paying attention to. I feel like I'm paying more attention to the fact that I have it. I wasn't going to say I'm paying attention more attention to my shame attendant, but that's not correct. I'm paying attention more to the fact that I have one, and that's just been very helpful in my everyday sort of just life. To understand and realize that it's there and understand what that is and where those thoughts and feelings are coming from. Have just been a great thing for me. And so thank you.
That's good. Yeah, you're welcome.
So today we're on chapter 6, and chapter 6 is titled Shame's Remedy, Vulnerability.
Yeah. Well, just to for a moment, Pep, just to jump on to kind of tag on to what you just said about paying more attention, to and aware that we have an attendant who's kind of talking to us all the time. And we'll get to this, even this chapter, that I think I'm better able to do that because I'm aware that I'm not alone with this thing. It's like evil wants to lull me into kind of this autopilot way of not paying attention to, not being aware that there's an attendant.
Yeah.
And I think that the joy that, for instance, that we share, that you and I share, like this connection that we have, is a significant way that gives me ballast and space. I can exhale and then pause and say, oh, wait, there's this shame attendant over here, but that's very different than what I hear Pepper saying. And if I don't have this relationship with you and with others of our, if I don't have that, I don't really have much to turn to other than this, and this thing becomes pretty automatic.
Yeah, I told you a little quick story when we were on video, and I think I'd like to share it here because it talks about, it really speaks to this to me. So I work from home mostly, and so once every couple of weeks, I'll go and work at a Starbucks first thing in the morning before my meetings start, so that I can just be around people, feel that energy. And I'm not talking to anybody or anything, but just the fact that they're there is helpful to me. And this past Monday, I went up and I was working. I had my AirPods in, my coffee, and I'm just kind of head down on the computer and doing my thing. And I had an alarm set for when I had to leave because I needed to be home for my first video conference. And I look up and it's just about time to go. And as I glance up, I realize that it's pouring down rain outside. Now, that normally wouldn't be a problem, except my Jeep is sitting in the parking lot with the top off because there was no rain in the forecast for this day on this past Monday. It was supposed to rain all week, but not Monday. So I have to get home. My Jeep is just getting drenched. So I go out, I just get in the car, and I think that prior to us working on this season and prior to me paying attention to shame, I know my shame attendant would have been saying, what an idiot you are getting caught in the rain with the top down. Right. And instead, my reaction was just to start chuckling. So I get in the Jeep and I turn the windshield wipers on because I can't see out the window. And I'm just getting soaked. So I start driving home and I'm laughing, but I'm not the only one laughing. Like everybody I pass, everybody on the road is just honking their horns, flashing their lights, and laughing. The worst part was when you had to stop at a light, because when you're moving, the brain kind of goes past you, but when you're stopped at a light, it's just dumping. It's just dumping on you, and you're just sitting there. And I have to say that one of the thoughts that was going through my head in the moment was, I can't wait to tell Curt the story, because and I think that is like bringing you guys into it with me, and
Right on.
all of that just is
Right
is
there.
like what you're saying. And so got home, changed my shirt, turned the heater on because it was freezing because I was soaked. But I mean, it's going to rain sometimes,
Right.
So what are you going to do?
Right. Well, and the other thing that's, you mentioned this when we were talking earlier. You said, like, okay, not only are people kind of like laughing, enjoying, but like, as you said, like, okay, you have a story to tell us. But not only that, but so do several hundred other people now have a story to talk about when they go home.
Exactly.
And here's the beautiful thing, is that it's not hard for people to imagine that if they were the one in the Jeep, like, they can imagine their own shame. I mean, they wouldn't be thinking this, right? But they would, like, how embarrassing, whatever. Except they're not seeing a guy who looks embarrassed. They're seeing a guy who is welcoming the moment. They're seeing a guy who looks like, oh my gosh, honey, I think this guy like waited till it started to rain, and then he got in his Jeep and he went out and started to drive around Covington just because, like, he could, I gotta get me some of that.
Yeah, exactly.
Whatever that guy has, I gotta get me some of that. And I think in some respects, it is a commentary on the way the gospel works. It is a commentary on how God comes to the places where we are most vulnerable and where we are most easily tempted to be ashamed. And he doesn't just stop the shame. He takes the moment and completely transforms it into an opportunity for joy.
Yeah.
Into an opportunity that isn't just joy for you.
Mm-hmm.
And for us who get to hear your story. It's going to be kind of like, as C.S. Lewis likes to say, it's going to be like the good infection that spreads to other people. And it as I forget who the writer is, that says, like, maybe it was Buechner, who's like, we're going to tear another piece off the darkness in those moments.
Right.
That's just that's a fabulous.
Yeah.
That's a fabulous story.
Well, Curt,
anyway.
Yeah. You start this chapter of this book and introduce a character story of Carla. Mm-hmm. And Carla comes in thinking that she wants a cure for her insomnia. I think is what it is. Yeah. This is sort of an ongoing theme for you. These patients come in and they think they want their gout cured, and then you take them to this whole other place and talk about ripping the scab off the darkness.
Wait, that was tear a little piece off the darkness. It's not ripping a scab off the darkness.
I like my version better.
All right, yeah, okay. Now the truth is out. That's really what I do. Come to my office. I'll.
You got one thing wrong with you, but we're gonna get the. No, there's a lot of truth and beauty to that too. I mean, yeah. But let's talk about Carla's story a little bit.
Yeah, so this is a woman who was in her legal career, had made her way up the chain in her firm, and she came in as is often the case. I'm here for my insomnia. I'm here for my anxiety. I'm here as if it is this thing that I have, and it's like something that's separate from who I am and my story and so forth. And pretty quickly, I'm just kind of walking through fairly standard questions that we would have, psychiatric evaluation. We find out that she's married, she has children. So I'm asking about her marriage, and she says it's fine. And the next thing you know, quite somewhat accidentally, but maybe perhaps not, it tumbles out that she's having an affair with one of the legal firm's partners. That's down the hall from her. And of course, then it became kind of like, oh my gosh, this just came out of my mouth. What the heck was I thinking or doing? And I'm thinking, well, I think finally, like, you've carried this for a long enough time and this is a space. And I think you've been waiting for an opportunity to tell somebody this,
Mhm.
because how long can you kind of bear this? It'd been going on for several months. And of course, this had begun with, lunches and then dinners and then conversations with this partner, her boss, who was more than happy to cooperate with this,
Right.
who he himself was in a listless marriage. But I think the point was that eventually, as she said this, she quickly kind of backed away from it and didn't really want to talk about it much anymore. And I said, well, I would be more than happy to work with you with your insomnia, but only I'm not going to give you medicine unless you're willing to come back and talk about your story, which we did. She was willing to do that. And eventually we got to the point of, and the affair was ongoing. It was active when she came in, and I invited her to consider the possibility of talking with her husband about this. And of course, I think the line she used, I said, was, "What's that like for you?" And she says, "I think I just want to throw up."
Right.
I'm like,
Right.
"Please, not on my nice couch." No,
Right.
I didn't say that. I might have thought it, but I didn't say it. Okay. But one can imagine, like, that it would feel like throwing up. Like, I would feel like throwing. I mean, I really get it. Like, she's not crazy for having that kind of. I completely get that. And at this whole notion of vulnerability was, we talk about this idea that for her to be vulnerable in many respects, it feels like it's like there's something wrong. Like, to be vulnerable with her husband Preston would have that would have been like ripping the scab off. You can't, like, nausea is the only way that you can imagine this. You imagine vulnerability as an awful thing, as
Right.
only as a dangerous thing, and we forget that vulnerable is who we actually are.
Yeah. Yeah. You say that vulnerable is not something that you have to do, because we just are.
Right,
We just are. Naturally, we are. Yeah.
right. We're the only animals that put clothing on ourselves because we have to. And so from even our very physicality requires protection. And then there's this whole notion of what our inside life is like. All these things that bang around in our head that we feel and that we think and that we sense that we would never reveal to anybody else. And we would think that it would be like, not only would it be, just embarrassing, but it would be unwise. It would not be smart to reveal to my friend this part of me that is really true. And so what we find is that we've actually been made this way. And of course, I think, like, this is just not really one of God's better moments, in making us vulnerable, until we find out that in the biblical narrative, we would see that he's actually made us like himself in this way as well. We don't imagine God being vulnerable, which is why Jesus upended that whole notion, this idea that God never asks us to do something that he's not willing to do himself. And even when God, you get the hint of this in Genesis 1:26, where, following all the things that he's made without consultation among himself, and God said, and there was light, and God said, and there was this, and there was that. Then there's this kind of moment of consulting. There's this, let us make mankind in our image. Like, we're going to have a conversation about this. We're going to consider it. As if he was aware of what was coming. As if he was aware that we're going to make mankind in our image, and we're going to make him to be vulnerable in the same way that we are willing to be. And there is a part of us that also is vulnerable. And we get to the apex, we get to the zenith of this created moment of vulnerability when we read at the end of Genesis 2, and the man and his wife were naked and unashamed. This whole notion that this is how we have been made. We have been made as we come into the world naked, we go out of the world naked, and Jesus also comes into the world naked as a newborn. He goes out of the world naked on a cross. And in between all this, God is saying, I make you this way because that nakedness, that vulnerability, we have it so that we can receive protection from the other. We can be connected to the other. So I need you for your protection of me and my protection of you. I need you for your help Like, you can help me and I want to help you. But at the core of this is, if we're going to really be like God and create beauty and goodness in the world, I need my vulnerability. I need your vulnerability. We make things together most powerfully and most durably when we are vulnerable, and when shame is not in the conversation.
Mm.
And of course, for Carla, part of the challenge had been that, as a middle kid growing up in her home, shame had been quite subtly part of the message. She was someone who, because of the nature of how things operated in her home, she kind of kept her head down, did things really well, never got into trouble, worked really hard to make sure that, she was keeping the peace and everything was operating, because everything else other things were a little more chaotic between her older and younger siblings and her parents and so forth. And so she isn't really noticed as being as being trouble.
Right.
Carla's no trouble. And but that doesn't mean that trouble doesn't have to do with Carla. But her parents don't notice this. There's no sense in which we're going to be curious about you because I got so many other things I got to take care of. And so she goes into her adult life and she finds that by the time she gets to me, some of that sense that, like, I'm not that interesting, I'm not that, people aren't curious, and even my own husband, he's not that interested in me. We've got kids and I've got to, keep that running. And the one thing where she found energy and interest, and someone found her to be interesting, was the dude who occupies the corner office down the hall from her. And there's this sense in which it was in that space where she was finding life and light and interest and energy and all this, so that she hadn't felt for much of her life, this one part of her that hadn't really allowed that to happen. And so then it becomes this matter of, like, my gosh, how am I going to give this up? Like, I can't imagine giving this up or even speaking to my husband about this, because she would imagine the same thing that I would imagine that Adam and Eve would have been imagining when God comes to find them in Genesis chapter 3. There's this sense in which, when we are in trouble, when we are in Carla's shoes, the last thing I want to do is to reveal, is to be vulnerable, is to be who I am, because it's so noxious for me to imagine that. It makes me want to throw up.
Mm-hmm.
And it's in that state of shame that it's very difficult for me to imagine that God would ever want to come to find me with any other posture other than to kill me. He's upset, he's angry, he's disappointed, all the things that, like, look, I don't need you. Like, I'm doing well enough on my own here, telling myself like what an awful person I am. Like, I'm good enough at this. Like, I don't need God's help in reminding me of who I am. And we see that the man and the white and the woman were kind of perhaps worried. I mean, he had said, on the day that you eat, that day, like, you're going to die. Well, I guess this is it. And so they're hiding. They're hiding from each other. They're hiding from God. And God comes to find them. And he asks this question, where are you? And what God's actually, he's not primarily seeking to punish them. Now, of course, my shame, if I'm Adam, like, I don't know that. I can't see that. I can't imagine that what God is still seeking is naked creativity with me. Even in this moment, God is wanting to do something more. He's not just coming to punish. And it reminds us that God is always in the business of connecting on the way to correcting. But first we connect, and then we correct. He fully connects with us in Jesus on Good Friday. And resurrection ushers in the correction that we're able to follow, but not before. I mean, even his disciples, like, couldn't get it before the resurrection. As passionately committed as Peter claimed to be, even he's going to throw Jesus under the bus. Like, it's clear, like, it's hard for that, and they all scatter. And so Jesus joins us. It's this question of, first, God comes to connect, and then correct. But this is difficult for us to imagine. If we haven't had any practice, it's hard to submit ourselves to the opportunity, to the possibility that you, Pepper, would want to connect with me in the face of knowing the things about me that, like, if I tell you, like, you're like, no, you're not, you're like, no, this is going to be done. No more podcast. No more, nothing. And because this vulnerability means that what God is trying to do is to get as close to us as we are willing to allow him to be in our imaginations. And so we recognize that vulnerability is the state through which we must pass in order to connect. The other thing that this does, I mean, this doesn't always kind of just as a theological idea. I don't know how much of a difference it makes for us, but like what we're already seeing here are hints of the Trinity. This notion of let us make mankind, we're seeing hints of it. And we're seeing hints of God wanting us to know that we're not alone. In the same way that God is not alone. God's not a monad. He's not just a single deity. There is this relational aspect of God. And if we imagine that what God is doing is not so much a matter of him, this like singular person over here and we're over there. But if we imagine that there are three of them and they come into the room and they say, we want you to be part of us. We want you to join our team. We're having a dinner. We are having a dinner and we want you to be at the table. We know, we who know, we know about, we know Carla, we know. And we don't want some other Carla. We don't want some Carla who's never made a mistake. The Carla that you thought you needed to be growing up in your family where you needed to keep the peace. We want the Carla who's sleeping with her boss, who's not her husband. That's the Carla that we want. It's very difficult for us to get
because because he wants to make that connection.
That's right.
Before any correction.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's so difficult to imagine through our shame that anyone would want to make that connection. I mean, like, I think of this is like, so your story, there is a sense in which your willingness to pay attention to your moment in the way that you were makes it possible for you to connect with all those people who are passing you. And because you're not letting shame get in the way of that. And it is a thing, like it becomes like, oddly enough, it's a gift of laughter and a gift of presence and a gift of connection that in order for that to happen, we have to be willing to exhale and put our shame aside, which is hard to do. But what we recognize then at the end of the day, that what God is really doing, he's coming to be known. He wants us to be known by him. And he wants to be known by us as well. There is this sense that we are creatures who know things and who long to be known. And we always like to say that when we want, the part of us that longs to know, it's a necessary, important part. It's one side of the coin of the way our mind works, dominantly out of the left hemisphere of our brain. But it is typically singular in the sense that, like, I am the agent who is going to go on the internet and look up this piece of information. I'm going to go to the library. I'm going to do this work. Now, I may get information from you, but I'm the primary one who's seeking knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
I'm in the driver's seat for this whole enterprise. The dark side of that is, of course, that it reflects my intention to want to know things. And if I can know more and more and more and more and more, the closer I get to being like God, which is the only person who actually knows everything.
Yeah. And I don't need anybody else because I know everything and I don't need you.
Right.
Right.
Right. I mean, ultimately, that's why I would want to know everything, because it helps me protect myself from the vulnerability of the wound and the being left and all those kinds of things. But being known is a different way of operating. It much more heavily involves my right hemisphere, much more heavily involves my embodied experience of being seen by someone else, much more heavily involves my activated nonverbal cues that I'm sending to others and that others are sending to me, whether I'm aware of it or not. And it is a corporate act. It doesn't, it is me submitting. I'm giving myself to someone else to know things about me. I'm going to be known. I'm going to have this experience in which I am in a vulnerable place. I'm not in the driver's seat. And this way of being known is the way that our healing of our shame can commence. This shame that we keep hidden. And this is the other thing that I think that we often, at least I often lose track of this, that it is God also who longs to be known by us. Like, I think, like, why does God need to be known? Like, what does he want anything? Like, what am I going to add to God's life? How does God having the experience of being known by me, like what? And our theologians might say, well, that's all, Curt, for your benefit. Like, no, actually, the scriptures, especially you get the Old Testament major prophets, where God talks about his longing for the people of Israel. That's not a God who doesn't need things, who doesn't want things. This is a God who's like, I'm jealous for what God says that doesn't also then come to kill us. This is a God who longs to be known. And I think of it, I mean, your kids are now,
Yeah, I was just going to say, the obvious way that I would relate to this is, I have such a desire for my kids to know me, and for them to hear my stories and react to them, and obviously for me to know them and know their stories, and that's the relationship. And I can't imagine my life without that. It is such a fulfilling and wonderful part of my life, my relationship with them.
Yeah.
And it is definitely a give and take, but it gives you a glimpse into this idea of God wanting to be known, because I
Right.
want that same thing. Yeah.
Right. And, I think there will always be ways in which, because my kids are my kids, there are ways in which I won't be fully known by them in the way, for instance, that I'm known by Phyllis, or
Right.
in ways in which that I might be known by you because you're my peer. There are ways in which we can know
Sure.
things collectively because generationally my kids are, in a different space. But the parts of me that that can be known by them, I desperately want those parts to be known. I remember when we were, we talked about this when we were doing parenting work with, and especially with fathers, but not limited to them. I say, like, look, one of the most powerful gifts that you can give to your kids over the course of their lifetime is the way in which you, at developmentally appropriate stages, reveal to them the story of your life. Telling them your story at developmentally appropriate ages. And I remember my kids, they were like, they were about probably 7 or 8 years old when we started to, they started, into school, and once a month we'd go to McDonald's for breakfast. And, I'm sure I did it, quite imperfectly, but my longing was to, even with an 8-year-old, is to begin to introduce them to things about me. And so, like, our daughter Rachel, who was we were on this long trip. We were going to a wedding in North Carolina where we were invited, and she was a flower girl, but she's like 6 or 7 years old. And but our son, being as young as he was so Phyllis and he flew. We were living in Pittsburgh at the time. They flew to North Carolina. Rachel and I got in a car and we drove. I remember we stopped in West Virginia. We leave early in the morning. We stop in West Virginia for lunch. And we get out of the car and we go in and we're sitting down at the table at McDonald's. And she says, "Daddy, this must be really good for you. You don't have to go to work. You don't have to talk to patients. And you don't have to talk to mommy." And I said, "Oh my gosh, I feel so fully known." I didn't say that to her. My wife Phyllis fortunately thought this was pretty hilarious.
Yeah.
But like this felt sense of like, oh my gosh, she's only 6 or 7 years old and she's already kind of sensing this. Like there's some part of me, not all of me, but there's some part of me that feels known by my kid. And even at that stage, like oh gosh, I love that I feel known by my kid. And I just want to say, this is an imprint. This is part of what it means to be made in God's image. That God has God, I'll never fully know, like he's not gonna be fully known by me, but this sense that there are parts of him that really long to be known by us and to send us the message that, yeah, I want to be known by you. Like you're that important to me. You make that much of a difference in my life. This whole notion of withness, that he's coming for us in this way, this power of withness. We'll talk about it in our next episode, the power of this, even in connection with just the way our brain works. But this withness is not just, oh, I want to come into the room and be with you and then I'm going to leave. This notion that God is coming to stay. God wants to be with us. God wants us to know that he's with, like Jesus, like, and lo, I'm with you always, even to the end of the age. Notice Jesus doesn't say, and lo, you have everything I've said. See ya. Lo, I am with you always. I think of, the woman who had a bleeding problem in Mark's, in the Gospels, and in Mark's version of this, she comes and of course she has an idea in her mind about what healing is going to look like. I just need to get my bleeding stopped. And she does it in a most invulnerable way, right? She's going to hide. She's going to like work her way through the crowd. She's just going to tag on his garment. She's not like blind Bartimaeus yelling from the side of the road. She's just going to hide and do her thing. And then like all the wheels come off her plan. Because Jesus comes to be fully with her, not just with her bleeding, but with all the other parts of her about which she feels so much shame. He's coming to plant his flag and stay, dwelling with us. And he comes to, but he doesn't come like a Roman emperor. He doesn't come like he comes vulnerably. We often talk about the 7 I ams that Jesus speaks in John's gospel. I am the bread of life. I'm the light of the world. I'm the good shepherd, and all the others. This notion of like, we who take that as, I think we've probably said this before on our podcast, these are words of comfort and joy, but they were also the very words that got him killed. He's being vulnerable. He is revealing who he is. He's being opened. This is who I am. And we kill him for it. And it's just reminding us that crucifixion, like it is a thing that lets us know that Jesus knows exactly what it's like for us to be us. Mm. Because it's fully exposed physically, fully exposed emotionally, fully exposed in all that he is, because he's trusting that something else is coming.
Well, I think that it was this chapter where you talked about the fact that when in those times when people were crucified, they were crucified without any garments on. They were crucified naked.
Right.
And we don't see many depictions of that, because it makes us feel so much embarrassment and shame. We can't even look upon that. But it just is a picture of how vulnerable that he was.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And we often think too that, well, Jesus was just that way. He was vulnerable, and so we even in our shame, we tell a story and we even interpret scriptures in certain ways that have us feel like Jesus is completely alone. But there is a part of him that is always staying in touch with something. We even often quote Psalm 22 in the opening words of my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" which Jesus quotes from the cross in Matthew's gospel. If we remember that Matthew's gospel is one in which he has Jesus quoting a lot from the Old Testament, because Matthew's writing to a Jewish population. And there's a way in which we might say it was the best of times and it was the worst of times, and we can just use those lines, and we know that we're talking about A Tale of Two Cities and Dickens. We don't have to like quote the whole book. We don't have to say we don't have to say the title. When Matthew says this, we know that he's pointing to Psalm 22. He's not just pointing to the first words of Psalm 22. He's pointing to the whole Psalm 22. And when you read the entire Psalm, we see that you get to the middle of the Psalm and everything turns. And the end of the Psalm ends in vindication and joy and healing. And this is what Jesus is having to pay attention to, even in the middle of his vulnerability. And this is what resurrection points us to. This is what ascension points us to. And then there is this sense of rhythm, right? This sense that to be with us is not to stare at us, to never leave, to never give us a break. It is this, to be vulnerable means we rhythmically do this, just like we rhythmically breathe, just like we rhythmically we're awake and then we sleep, and then we're awake and then we sleep. We come and be with, and then we might go into the kitchen and then we come back, and we go into the living room and then we come back. We go off to work and we come back. Nobody's demanding that we only be this naked vulnerable, offer this naked vulnerability like 24/7. We need to rhythmically approach this. But we have to remember that even in our movement toward vulnerability and toward healing, evil is not about to go quietly into the night. And evil wants us to believe, for instance, that for many, for our listeners, it's easy for us to think, gosh, I think that vulnerability is really going to apply mostly to like the big ticket items. Like in Carla's story, it's like, oh yes, we can see that vulnerability is an important thing to consider because she had an affair. But as we'd like to say, shame isn't just operational in those things that we would see as horrendous or big. It starts in microscopic moments, as we've talked about in previous episodes. It starts with little things. It doesn't begin with large events. And for Carla, it didn't begin with a large event. She didn't just one day decide when she was 18, I think that when I'm around in my 30s, I'm going to have an affair with somebody. That's what I'm planning to do. No, this becomes kind of like the frog that's slowly being cooked in water whose temperature increases. This is what happens to us. We like to say that shame begins with a whisper and crescendos to a roar. And this is what happened with Carla, and this is what happens with us. And we work so hard to keep the whispers of shame at bay that by the time they're roaring, we wonder how we got here, and we think that that's the only thing that's going on. But actually, the devil's been long in the small details and continues to be, even as Carla started on her journey of healing. And so we discover that if we're going to be vulnerable, we talk about this notion of you're familiar with this in movies and in plays, this golden circle. So I got introduced to this idea when Rachel, the same daughter who I had that lovely conversation with at McDonald's, that roadside stop in West Virginia, when she provided so much insight about my marriage, she has had a long-standing interest in acting and was involved in her high school and she had to she wrote her own one-act play, and she talks about this golden circle. And even in her one-act play, she implemented this notion that you begin at a certain point and you work your way through the themes of the play or the movie, and you come back to that moment. And what we find is that, Carla came into the world as a vulnerable kid, as we all do. And the traumas and chaos of her world, put her in a position in which she had to become increasingly protective of the vulnerable part of her. And that protection led eventually to her ignoring and hiding the parts of her that longed for things and that thirsted for things and hungered for things, until she found herself in this affair. But her healing eventually had to make its way forward by once again being vulnerable, because that's actually, again, how we've been made and how we have been made to flourish, to create beauty and goodness in the world. Shame does everything it can to mar that, to have us wrapping ourselves in as much protective garmentry as we can. I don't even know if garmentry is a word.
It works for me.
But I mean, it's just, it's really quite striking that our healing begins in the places where it's really hard to go.
Yeah.
And I want our listeners to know that, like, uh, this is hard to do. This willingness and choice to live as we actually are, to live in the real world, to live with wisdom in our vulnerable selves. It's hard to do because evil is waiting to devour us in the process. But I want us to know that because of Jesus, because of Christmas, because of Good Friday, because of Easter, because of Ascension, because of Pentecost, because of a future Perusia, a future appearance, this way that we've been made as people of vulnerability is going to continue to be the way that God ushers in the new heaven and the new earth. And so that's reason for good news and a lot of hope.
Yeah. Yeah. This idea of having to strengthen vulnerability is a big deal. Having to find your way back to it to work through.
Yeah.
Do you have an application for us this week, Curt?
Yeah. So I thought this week, for our listeners, I just want to invite us to reflect. Just again, every time we think about application, we're thinking about not just imagining things, but anytime you can write about them, anytime you can journal about them, it's going to be. And we repeat this all the time because writing about them slows the brain down, slows our mind down, lets us imagine things, lets us. It puts us in contact with things that we otherwise aren't in contact with, and we miss out on. This week, I want to invite us to reflect on the parts of your story that feel vulnerable. What are those parts? And sometimes like we have such allergic reactions to our vulnerability that we won't even look at it. So like even the idea that I'm going to look at a part of me that feels vulnerable, like I don't want to do that. Which ones have you kept hidden in order to protect you? What do you wish you could experience with someone who came to know those things about you, for which you carry so much shame? Like, what do you wish could happen? You said, "Well, I'm not even going to write that down because I don't think that's going to happen." Like, it certainly isn't going to happen if I'm not willing to name what it is that I want, name what it is that I wish for. What feels most uncomfortable about the notion of being known by someone in this way? What are we afraid is going to happen? And when I say, what are we going to afraid is going to happen? I'm like, write down, like, well, if you were to pick a person that you would love to be known more by, what are you afraid that real person, what are you afraid that Jason, what are you afraid that Sarah would actually do in real, what would they say? What would they do in real time and space if you were to be known by someone in this intimate way? And now, of course, the hard part, any of these things that you're reflecting on and writing down, how many of them, which of those things would you share with someone that you trust and consider doing just that? That's our application for the day, the very act of which is an act of vulnerability. And so we appreciate how hard this can be, but also how much beauty can emerge from it.
Awesome. Thank you, Curt. Thanks for this chapter. It's really helpful. And thank you for this application. I'll be digging into it this week.
Well, thank you. And Pep, I will be looking to go back and scroll through the local Cincinnati news reel library to see who captured on film some dude.
I'm sure it's out there somewhere.
Driving in a downpour with his open Jeep, having the time of his life.
Yep. All right. I love you, Curt. Stick around. We've got bonus with Amy coming up for the people watching on YouTube.
Yeah, two things stood out, and I kept trying to think of other stuff, but this idea, like that we are vulnerable at all times. And it's not this like, oh, we have moments of vulnerability. We have moments of awareness.
Right.
But then it's like, okay, and vulnerability is our ticket to flourishing. I mean, like, vulnerability and flourishing are connected.
Right.
And so for me, it was like, okay, that redirects my attention from trying to eradicate vulnerability,
Mm-hmm.
which, oh
Mm-hmm.
my gosh, that would be horrible. Because
Right.
I can remove myself from being vulnerable, and that is a very small life.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think of the myriad ways that I actually do that
Mm-hmm.
on a
Mm-hmm.
regular basis.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm not, I've not become a hermit,
Right.
right? I'm not removing myself, but like, I'm the guy who, I mean, we have this lovely neighborhood that
Mm-hmm.
we've lived in for almost 30 years,
Wow.
and my wife, Phyllis, she loves to get behind. She invites women over to have
The one you don't want to
margarita.
talk to. The wife you don't want to talk to. Okay, yes.
Okay.
Invited over. That was
Yeah,
so
and like
funny.
and when we have like holidays where we'll like we're in the past where you block off the end of the street and you just bring stuff out, and the neighborhood comes together and we have cookout or whatever. I am supremely self-conscious
Wow.
at these things, like, because I don't, it's not like I mean, I see my neighbors frequently throughout the day, but I don't have a lot of I don't spend a lot of deep intimate time with my neighbors, and I'm just very self-conscious about this. And so I have this narrative in my head,
Dialogue.
this dialogue, right? Well, it's not even between me and my shame attendant.
Yeah.
It's kind of a one-way. It's more like a monologue, and I'm the one who's listening.
Yeah.
And the primary, the main version of it goes something like, I'm just really pretty uninteresting, and they're not really going to be that interested
Oh
in
my
talking to me.
gosh.
Like, I'm going to be perceived as being boring, and like, I mean, and
And then you want to go home. You want to go home. It would be like, you guys have fun.
So I have to, like, I come up, I develop a tactic for how I go to this neighborhood gathering, and the tactic is, I think of like, who are the 2 or 3 people that I'm going to try to have conversations with,
Mm-hmm.
so that I can be comfortably engaged for like 20 minutes with this person.
Uh-huh.
And then, and whereas my wife is just kind of like very comfortably moving from this person for a few minutes, and this person for a few minutes, and this person for a few, and I'm like, I don't know how to do small talk. I'm not like, and it's not just because, I'm not interested in small talk, that's beneath me. I mean, like, it's a matter of like, I don't know how to do this. And she said, she said, Curt, look, you went to a small Christian college. You didn't go to enough frat parties. Like,
that's your problem.
She said, like, I got practice when I was in college, and like, and they weren't even, they weren't, alcoholic infused. Like, she just had lots of experience with lots of parties where you practice
gathering.
but not me. And so I have this sense of like, I'm not that interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like the engine that drives everything. So like, I will find ways, like my vulnerability, like I respond by encasing myself, which doesn't make me less vulnerable. It just makes me less. No, it just makes me less connected.
Right. Which then it's like a vicious circle. Then because that just feeds you're not interesting, which you're anything but not interesting.
Well, and I can imagine the message that I could end up sending without trying to send this is to other people, is that I don't think that they're interesting either.
Right.
Because I'm not like moving from person to person to person to person. Like, it's.
Yeah.
Yeah. You said two things you said.
Okay. So the other thing, and this is like kind of in left field. So we're first, maybe not first, but we're physically vulnerable, and that our mind can't tell the difference between physical and emotional. Like, so then I thought, and I want to hear your thoughts on that, but then I thought, okay, Free Solo, that movie, where the guy climbs El Capitan without ropes, without anything, right?
In beauty, yeah.
So and others that do like these extreme adventures and put themselves in tremendous physical vulnerability. So then I thought, okay, does their brain, are they more easily vulnerable emotionally and relationally because they experience physical vulnerability with greater intensity? Does that make sense?
Well, I think if you're asking this question, if I understand your question, you're being curious, like what is it like to be someone? I'm forgetting the climber's name.
I know.
I can see him,
Yep. Yeah.
and
I can hear him.
yeah,
Talking.
yeah, and you wonder, like, well, one can only imagine that at a certain level, the vulnerability that we all sense as we're watching that unfold is something to which he may not have that much access to. In other words, he may not have the same sensitivity to his physical vulnerability as you or I would have if we suddenly found ourselves, for me, like even 10 feet up on El Cap,
It's right. Looking
let
at it.
alone, whatever,
Yeah.
right? And so some of this does have to do with certain, sensitive, and so to this example about me and my neighbor and our neighborhood parties, like we know that children come into the world temperamentally relatively shy or relatively less shy. So kids come into the world with, and some kids are, if you've got a more active right hemisphere, you tend to be a little more observant. You're not as comfortable with novel stimuli. So you kind of like watch and wait. If you've got a relatively more highly active left hemisphere, you're more attracted to, captivated by, compelled by novel stimuli. You're drawn to this, and so you go toward that. So I'm in the former category. I was constitutionally shy. I'm like a 4-year-old walking into kindergarten with my 17-year-old brother who's driven me to school. And we walk in past all these high school girls who are just being sweet and nice because I'm my brother's brother. And I just get through this gauntlet of girls.
Just get through it. Just survive it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so for people like our climber, his awareness and his comfort level with doing lots of things that are novel, that he perceives certain things. He does not perceive certain things to be dangerous that we perceive to be, in the same way that I perceive to be walking through the gauntlet of girls to be a dangerous thing.
Right.
The challenge is, of course, that we do tend to, strength begets strength in terms of neural real estate. And if I'm paying attention to these kinds of things and I'm engaged in these kinds of things and so forth and so on, I'm not engaging in other things. So what strikes me as and this is for anybody who's watched the movie, what strikes, I think, anybody who's watched the movie is the relationship between the climber and his girlfriend. It's a stunning example of, when you watch her experience of this,
right,
it raises questions about what's going on.
Yeah.
When you there's another movie, documentary movie called The Alpinist.
I haven't seen it, but I've heard of it.
Yeah, which it's a similar kind of, and the climber that is followed in that documentary, when you start to, the stories are about, and the way the story is told, there's a lot of attention paid to the act of climbing and all that this means and so forth and so on. There's no attention paid to the dynamics of their relational interactions with the people that are most deeply attached to them. Now when I say that, I don't mean that there's no, like with Free Solo, it's not like there's no attention paid to it and you see it, but it's not a movie that is attempting to ask the question, what's What's the overall general relational health of the main characters?
Right.
That's not the question that the movie is asking.
Mm-mm.
Because if it were, then we might find that our characters in both of these films
Mm-hmm.
would be revealed to have certain kinds of vulnerability that are infinite in their depth, that they have worked really hard to protect.
Yeah. See, that's so interesting because it's like my initial thought was like this week was like, does that enhance their ability to respond to vulnerability? And it could be quite the opposite because you have to turn off a certain, if you're going to climb El Capitan without ropes.
Right. You're not, I can tell you, like, you're not paying
Okay.
attention to what impact this has on your girlfriend.
Right.
And
Or
no
even
one,
on yourself, right? Even,
exactly.
yeah.
So, and that's the thing. If I'm cut off from others to begin with, to the degree that I'm cut off from others,
Mm-hmm.
is going to be the degree to which I'm cut off from parts of me.
Mm-hmm.
And the parts that I'm not cut off from, the parts of me that can climb really well and do all those kinds of things, those are the parts that are going to get lots and lots and lots of attention and practice. And the more they get practiced, the less everything else gets practiced. And so the rich become richer in one sense, and the poor become poorer in another sense. And it's like, so the very act, like Free Solo, I mean, like, it's a commentary on Western culture. It's not just a story about a climber.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's like, what are we paying attention to?
Right. And the thing is that, like, all it would take would be, and we all know this, and this happens time and time again. We hear about these, you know, the kind of like the extreme sporting folks, like the number of deaths that take place because of people who are like, and you're like, okay, like, you're just, you know, you roll the dice, you play the numbers, and at some point it's likely that you're going to end up dying, and nobody's going to be surprised, and anybody who knows you is going to be furious and grief-stricken, and that's what they'll be left with. Because in many respects, there is a certain sense in which, you know, just looking at the relative, you know, chances, if we just look statistic probabilities, you know, any of us, like, if you just go out and get in your car, there's the chance that, you know, you something bad could happen, but not quite like it is if I'm trying to climb El Cap without any ropes.
Right.
And I just want to say, like, I'm not sitting here in, like, sitting in judgment about that. We're just making observations about the way humans work.
Right.
And if, you know, for our listeners, if what you really want are deeply connected relationships in which you are flourishing vulnerably in the way you are most deeply made to flourish vulnerably, that's going to happen necessarily in relationships with other people in which your vulnerable self is connected with their vulnerable self, so that you can both have your shame be healed, and so that you can both go on to co-create beauty and goodness in the world.
Well said.
Because in some respects, we might say, yeah, it is a, you know, when we watch Free Solo, like, it clearly is a commentary on what that one person is able to do.
Yeah.
I'm not sure to what degree, and we might say, oh gosh, that inspires a lot of people to do hard things, which that may be true. That's possible. The challenge is that the inherent storyline underneath this is that the hard things that you must do on your own without any assistance.
Right.
And the likelihood that leads to life ultimately, or that it leads to me ultimately becoming a better version of myself,
yeah,
I would say the jury's still out on that.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
It's a great reflection, though, that you're talking about. That's a really great example of kind of, in some respects, the antithesis of what we're really
searching for or striving for. Yeah. But and then the idea that we are vulnerable, so I can stop trying to eradicate that and embrace it, and for the beautiful thing that it is.
Yeah. So I'm going to say this while we're here, and I can just say this because it's you and me talking, and not just because Pepper's not here.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I mean, I want to say, I don't, has it been 10 years that we've known each other? Has
You
it,
and
has it
I?
been, I
I
can't
think
remember.
it's close. Did seasons start 2013?
I can't remember. My book came out in
It's
2010. I first met Nicole Johnson in the summer of 2010, and then I don't know if it was the spring of
been
2011 or spring of 2012 when we gathered in Southern California that first time, when all of us were
then
there.
it's been 10 years because it's at least since 2012. It might
Right.
have been a little bit
Right.
before. So yeah.
So in that time, and especially over the course of the time that we did seasons, all those number of weekends that we would share together, you and I have had any number of really deep, meaningful conversations together.
Yeah.
And I would say that just an added element that is significant is that like, I'm a dude and you're a woman.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
and there are certain ways in which, of course, we long to be vulnerable with everybody, but we also want to do so with wisdom and grace and care and so forth. And so anytime we say it, like anytime men and women are in the room, like sex is in the room. Like, we say there's this notion of like, and it's not like, people aren't having sex, but this notion of longing to be known, even in that way, this longing to be known deeply by someone of the other gender, to be cared for, because there's parts of me.
And that is true. So it's like vulnerability is true. That is true. So we don't have to, our response to it is what we can focus on, not that the fact that it's here and eradicate it.
Right. And in so naming it, we also create protection for our relationship. But I just want to say, for a listening audience, because you and I don't get to have these opportunities, like, I just want to say how grateful I am for our relationship. And for the number of times I remember the summer that we had seasons, and we were having it was a seasons weekend, and it was sometime in June, early July or whatever. And my brother Mark was near death. And I remember being comforted by you. And others at seasons, but I just remember that, and I'm just saying, like, I'm just really grateful for the relationship that I've had. I know Pepper would say the same thing about the stories that we've shared with each other about our lives, in which that vulnerability has been true, and just really grateful for that.
Yeah, I'm so grateful. And what I think of is like, and we'll talk about it more next week, but confessional communities. Like, I didn't even know what we go into it sometimes not knowing, like the conversations you and I have had that are vulnerable and share things that, not everybody knows, or just an openness, but not even knowing. It's almost like I fell into it, like our conversations, that it's just like, just show up and talk, and the magic happens. Like, it's just, and we don't find that with everyone, but we have found it. And I am, I can think of so many conversations at seasons that were deep and rich and fun. And
yeah, right on.
All right, this has been good.
It's been great. Right.
We don't have Pepper to sign us or get us out of here.
No, but we'll see him and we'll see each other next week.
Yep.
All right.
Thanks, Curt.
All right. Thanks.
This podcast is produced by Curt Thompson, Pepper Sweeney, and myself, Amy Chella. Audio production and editing is by Keaton Simons. Video production and editing is done by Mark Gould. If you'd like to connect with us, you can find us on social media at Being Known Pod. If you like this podcast, tell a friend. If you love this podcast, tell everyone you know. And please like, rate, and review wherever you listen. Be well, be known.